This guy's a vegetable and a plot device. Today I talk about the webtoon The Villainess Turns the Hourglass, also titled 악녀는 모래시계를 되돌린다. It's a webtoon authored by SANSOBEE and illustrated by Antstudio. It happens to be one of those fantasy and romance stories that seem to be surging in popularity nowadays. At least it feels like they're surging in popularity. Over the last few years, I found myself delving into these webtoon and manga that cater towards a younger adult female audience, or to anyone who enjoys watching a female protagonist go through a very unique type of power fantasy. For those of you who are unfamiliar, these sort of stories usually involve our protagonist waking up in the body of a younger version of the villainess from a fictional otome game or novel. The protagonist is usually aware they're heading for a bad ending and seeks to change their fate, and in doing so, we, the audience, get to enjoy the whole process. Usually in their efforts to change their predetermined demise, they may pick up a lover along the way. Or several. Some even gather a reverse harem. There are many little variations to this formula, but at their core, these types of stories have some sort of turn back the clock premise. And I have to say that there's something irresistible about the idea of being able to go back in time and fixing all your mistakes. We as the audience are allowed to experience this vicariously through our protagonist in some of our most favorite settings and genres of fantasy. This is probably also the reason why some of the narratives in these types of stories rely on using gaming features and vaguely familiar settings. However, unlike the typical male protagonist you see in isekai power fantasy stories, female protagonists in this genre are generally a little more thoughtful, rational, and logical, as opposed to being powerful demigods gifted with supreme magic power or strength for arbitrary reasons. I've come to really enjoy these types of protagonists as I get older, and it's quite progressive to see female characters with non-expositional brains and beauty now saturate this medium. Now the reason why I'm pointing all this out is because the webtoon The Villainess Turns the Hourglass happens to be one such story that follows the general premise of turning back the clock and fixing your past mistakes. Kind of. But it also seems to really take the whole turn the hourglass thing in its title a bit too literally as well. Now before I make this intro any longer than I mean to, let's begin the review. Our story opens with a flashback and an execution scene where we are first introduced to our protagonist, Aria Rosent. Yes, I know, it's very typical for a villainous story to always begin with the bad end. Unlike the more tame version of the bad end where your villainess gets exiled, Aria gets decapitated. Makes you really wonder what crime she committed to deserve having her own stepbrother be her executioner. Just when things can't possibly get any worse, Aria's stepsister appears and sends Aria along her merry way. I imagine that can't feel all that great, knowing that your supposed family orchestrated the events that led you to such a tragic end. Makes you lose your head, huh? Okay, I'll stop. Suddenly, Aria regains consciousness and finds out that she's now in the body of a younger version of herself and back in the past. She notices that there is a broken hourglass in her bed and interprets the message following her time leap as divine intervention. We are then introduced to Aria's family. There's the father, Count Rosent, Aria's mother and the Count's second wife, the firstborn son, Kane Rosent, and our antagonist, also in her younger form, Miel Rosent. After a family scene that involves Aria and Miel attempting to one-up each other, Aria has now found a new goal in her second lease on life, which is to destroy her family before they funnel her back to her bad end. Yep. The best way to make use of your second life is to hurt the people who will hurt your future self first. And to that end, Aria butters up her tutor who is destined for success so that she may become a sponsor one day. Aria then proceeds to create designs on stealing away Miel's fiancé, Oscar Frederick, who happens to belong to the local duke's family. Moving forward again, Aria one-ups Miel by providing invaluable business advice of purchasing large quantities of fur to the Count Rosent, while handily slapping down Miel's idea of investing in leather. We then follow Aria as we find out that she has commissioned an old man to fix up the hourglass that was broken on her bed in the beginning. And after warning the old shopkeep to sell off an auction ticket, stuff happens. Seems like someone is interested. Someone who will probably end up as a love interest if the scene is any indication. Aria weasels her way out of this predicament and apparently leaves quite the impression on our dark stranger, who then mistakes this notable young lady for Miel. Understandably so, after the dark stranger's entourage notices the crest of House Frederick on her bling. I have nothing to say to that one. I think all the scenes that led up to this key event were well executed, but it seems we now have a huge misunderstanding in our midst. Look at this guy. This poor fool is smitten and I doubt he realizes it. And we all know where this is going. Anyway, the days go by until another key event occurs where we finally get to meet Oscar, Frederick, and Ernest. Guess what? He's quite taken with Aria's charms, and after outfoxing her sibling again, Aria proceeds to water Oscar for the vegetable that he is. But you know, he doesn't seem to mind, because he's a damn vegetable, and Aria knows it. So, giving a handkerchief is apparently a way to let a man know a woman is interested, so Aria manages to capitalize on the situation and give her sister's fiancé a fine handkerchief. Do you see this poor fool's face? He knows he's screwed. Obviously, Miel isn't happy. It's at this point where we up the stakes because after this little incident, Miel is quickly resorting to sinister means of retaliation. And before I finish this section off, you remember this poor fool? Yep, he's back, and his name is supposedly Asher. I think now I'll leave the section where it is because you now get the gist of how this story is going to go. I should probably also mention that I only summarized the key events from the first 14 chapters. And before I forget, I should probably mention that Aria discovers that turning the hourglass that got repaired allows her to turn back time for a few minutes. Yeah, probably should have mentioned that one earlier, but the story really does introduce this titular item after a whole bunch of events have already passed. Our protagonist is Aria Rosent, the illegitimate daughter born between a count and a prostitute. She spent her first life as a typical villainess who relied solely on her looks and seductive charm to survive the rigors of high society. As if reloading from an earlier save point, she is currently in her younger self and retains all the knowledge of events to come. And how does she decide to use her second life? Does she try to improve her relationship with her family so they won't kill her? Does she find a man to marry in order to use his influence to protect herself? Does she train herself so that she can physically protect herself? Or does she prioritize setting aside some money and gathering influence? No, folks. In order to avoid a repeat of her tragic demise, she has set her new life's purpose to disgracing her stepsister, stealing her man, and ultimately aiming to have Miel's head on the chopping block. I love this girl. This is the type of protagonist that amuses me most. The one with the crappy plan with beautiful execution. Aria's character design is considerably more sharp than her sister Miel, and as far as character design goes, I'm fine with it. She doesn't look like a particularly dangerous villainous character, but more so the annoying kind. However, Aria is able to create a variety of facial expressions that is sometimes easy to forget what type of character that she is supposed to be. Like how actual humans have many facets to their character, she's quite expressive, and it's really one thing that caught my attention as I was reading through this webtoon. Now, Miel Rosent is the main antagonist and target of Aria's vengeance. She happens to exhibit a vicious and devious personality. Unlike Aria, however, I'm not too crazy about this character. Besides the obvious reason that she's the antagonist, I honestly don't understand why she needs to be this devious and sinister. The old Aria was well on her way to self-destructing as it was, so I'm not sure why Miel had to go out of her way to orchestrate her own stepsister's termination. As far as the plot is concerned, Miel fits her role well, but I can't shake the feeling that she feels like an empty antagonist. I could be mistaken and it may turn out that Miel will have some significant character development in later chapters, but I honestly don't see how she goes from this to this without any notable hardships. On another note though, watching her react to Aria's provocations is similar to watching a pot simmer and boil over. It's really not unusual for her to be driven to do something drastic, given how her stepsister is actually giving her a reason to harbor some murderous intent. Oscar Frederick. This guy is a vegetable and a plot device. Even Aria's mother feels more important than this guy, but I do get the feeling he's going to play a bigger role later. But honestly, Aria plays this guy like a fiddle. Asher. I don't know enough about him to make a proper comment, but I do know that he's important to the story. There are some unresolved issues I currently have with the story, but it really doesn't take away from how entertaining it is. Overall, I'm inclined to say that watching Aria wreck Miel's life is satisfying and somewhat cathartic. As I see it, the story really does seem to be centered around Aria and Miel. There are hints of romance, but it really does look like a revenge story. On that note, there are some things about Aria that I simply don't understand. Her motives are a bit of a mess. She's smart enough to know what's good for her, but constantly insists that her only motivation is to make Miel pay. Aria is even fully aware that her provocations are accelerating Miel's transition to the dark side. I can't say with any degree of confidence that Arya is doing what's best for herself, as she really is creating her own worst enemy and filling it with dangerous resolve. Now that's not to say this is a bad thing. I do think that a story where a protagonist is hell-bent on revenge to the detriment of everything else does have some merit. But I do feel like the sort of story usually ends up with a tragic ending. That'd really be a twist, wouldn't it? To have Arya play an active role in putting her right back on the chopping block. I'd personally love to see that, but I'm also aware of Asher's presence. If such an event were to occur and Arya is set up to be terminated again, I'd say Asher would probably stop it. Moving on, I do want to address the titular hourglass that Arya quite literally turns in order to turn back time, and I honestly don't know why the author decided to include this bogus item. I know it's in the title, but it really just feels like it's there to allow Arya to make some flaws so that she's more relatable. However, those flaws will then immediately be erased with a quick turn of her magical hourglass. I really do hope that there's a greater purpose to this because we already have a compelling story without it, and its conclusion can really complicate the story and undermine our protagonist's merits. I understand Arya's grand revenge plan doesn't always go the way she wants it to, and there are many events that simply happen, but that's what makes the whole story interesting. It's great to see Arya readjust and reevaluate as the situation develops, but the hourglass can potentially undermine this quality. Sadly, I haven't really read the web novel which the webtoon is based off of, so perhaps I might just be premature in my criticism. What I can get behind, however, is that Arya actually feels like a proper villainess. Her thoughts and actions are more or less consistent, at least where it concerns Miel. Arya's primary objective is to make Miel suffer. So far, most of Arya's actions serve this objective, and I haven't seen anything too wildly out of character. I also don't see Arya being hampered by modern-day ethics because she is not an isekai character. Arya actually feels like she's part of her world, and going through the motions of high society a second time is an acceptable explanation for why she's able to rewrite her bad image and curry favor. Listen, if you like stories that involve a villainess attempting to rewrite her bad ending, then you're in for a bit of a treat. The story constantly moves forward at a nice pace, and most of the chapters I've read always aim to achieve something. Each chapter has a lot of content, but it never feels too cluttered. If you're the type of person who loves this new line of shoujo villainess manga or webtoon, then this is definitely a series I'd recommend to you. There is a game being played, and romance has yet to spoil it. Rather, I'd say that the prospective romantic relationships add some spice to the mix. There are signs that indicate that we may have a love quadrilateral between Arya, Oscar, Asher, and Miel. This obviously is a recipe for disaster, but it's dramatic gold. I've already accepted that this webtoon is all about people ruining each other, so the prospect of a love quadrilateral sounds awesome. If you love watching dramatic disasters and acts of vengeance, then you'll like this. I plan to follow this story to its eventual end and will probably pick up the web novel soon myself. Maybe I'll even do a part 2 to this video as I've only covered but a fraction of the whole series so far. Hopefully, I've convinced some of you to do the same, or at least entertained you. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you like this review of my first impressions of this ongoing webtoon, then please feel free to like and or subscribe to the channel. I am the Weebtooner, signing off.